morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. As always, I'm Amber Duke, back at the desk again with Niall Stanage. Good morning.
Great to join you for a second day in succession. Second day of three, Amber, so I'm enjoying this spell.
Absolutely, me too. All right to the news then. Israel is poised to launch an attack on Iran, multiple outlets are reporting.
President Trump said recently that he had warned Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not to strike Iran, while the US was in the process of negotiating a nuclear deal.
As a result of the escalating tensions, the US is authorizing military family members to leave the Middle East and withdrawing diplomats from Iraq.
Here's President Trump last night on the situation.
Well, they are being moved out because it could be a dangerous place, and we'll see what happens. But they can't have a nuclear weapon. Very simple. They can't have a nuclear weapon. We're not going to allow that.
Iran's defense minister issued a warning to the US if conflict erupts after failed nuclear talks, saying, quote, America will have to leave the region because all its military bases are within our reach, and we will, without any consideration, target them in the host countries. A UN watchdog also ruled for the first time in 20 years that Iran was not complying with its nuclear proliferation obligations. Many on the right have been critical of a potential war with Iran. Daily Wire host Matt Walsh wrote on X, Iran does not pose any credible threat to the United States. We do not need to get involved in yet another war in the Middle East for reasons that have nothing to do with defending our own nation. Meanwhile, from the left, editor-in-chief of Midas News, Ron Filipkowski, wrote, all this Iran stuff must be fake news because Trump said no new wars would happen and that he would prevent all potential conflicts with his strong leadership and superior negotiating skills. Well, before we get into the Trumpian element of all of this, pretty ominous news, I would say, the suggestion that Israel might strike Iran. It is being reported by multiple outlets. There have been these moves by the US to move its personnel away from Iraq in fear of a potential Iranian reprisal if the Israelis hit Iran. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm deeply concerned, obviously. From the reports that we've been seeing, there's unconfirmed reports as well that Israeli military aircraft have been spotted over Iraq on their way to Iran. I really hope that this is not the case, but the Washington Post reported recently that the U.S. has become increasingly concerned that Israel is going to strike Iran without U.S. permission and potentially embroil us in this conflict. So I'm glad that the State Department is taking steps to make sure that our assets are moving out of harm's way if that is the case. But I think this is just an increasing signal from Israel that they are going to continue pushing for war with Iran. They obviously have a right to be concerned about nuclear proliferation, but the U.S. is in the middle of negotiations right now, and they have the potential to blow all of that up, for lack of a better analogy, if they decide to go ahead and preemptively strike while Donald Trump and his diplomatic team are trying to find some peaceful way out of this potential conflict.
Yeah, I think all of that is correct. I think it is interesting in relation to the Iran talks. The administration has said that Steve Witkoff, the negotiator in the Middle East, is going to continue to meet with Iranian negotiators as they try to get some kind of deal. Whether that deal will be successfully obtained or not is a very different question. But it's interesting to me that Witkoff and by extension Trump are keeping these talks going with the Iranians, even as it appears, at least, that Israel could be on the brink of striking Iran. To me, I mean, it points obviously to a divergence of a kind between Israel and the United States. And also, you know, quite frankly, I think one of perhaps our more uncommon points of agreement is the United States provides Israel with just this absolute avalanche of military aid. I think during the year after October 7th, it was about $17 billion. This was, of course, under the Biden administration, but aid continues and has continued over decades. And to be the recipient of that amount of American aid and then appear to be on the brink of striking Iran in obvious contravention of American diplomatic wishes, as well as the risks of a wider war. That seems unreasonable behavior, to put it mildly.
Yeah, indeed. And this is a new sort of cropping up of a way of thinking on the right in particular. I know the left has long been critical of Israel, But I think, looking back at the presidential primary debates, Vivek Ramaswamy really kind of broke the Overton window for Republican politics when he questioned the amount of aid that the United States gives to Israel, and also suggested that's what's best for Israel is not always what's best for America. And I think if Israel goes ahead and goes rogue and does this strike, you're going to see a lot of people who already had skepticism about the U.S.'s relationship with that ally start to move into that camp of, okay, maybe we need to actually rethink our entire alliance here. If we are providing them with so much of their capabilities, especially militarily and intelligence-wise, then the U.S. obviously gets a say to an extent of what Israel does with that money. Sure. And what are we going to do in response to make sure that they are held accountable for actively contravening the U.S. diplomacy?
Yeah, no, absolutely. On the point of the U.S. having a say, I mean, I was very critical here and elsewhere of the Biden administration because of the Israeli response in Gaza and what I considered a pathetic lack of effort to really impose or influence Israel in more in less callous directions, as I would say it. The point, though, I think that you make about Ramaswamy and so on is interesting because of the fact that foreign policy, it's not actually set in stone forever. When now President Trump began running for the first time, he was very critical of George W. Bush and the war in Iraq. And I remember at the time it was like, oh, you can't win a Republican primary with those kinds of views. They'll be perceived as critical of the military or too dovish or whatever. But in fact, what happened was even among the Republican electorate, I think there was a lot of weariness, partly because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And people were, in fact, open to hearing that argument even on the Republican side.
And I think there was a misunderstanding of what Reagan meant when he said peace through strength, where the neoconservative wing of the party thought that that meant you have to preemptively strike people or you have to actually use force in occasions where people are testing you. And really, I think Trump kind of flipped that on its head and said, well, peace through strength can mean strong diplomacy. And of course, if there is a red line, then you hold people accountable for crossing that red line. But it doesn't necessarily have to mean that the U.S. is involved in endless wars or has a presence everywhere in the world. It's a much more complex situation, as it should be when you're looking at a realist foreign policy.
No, absolutely. And military intervention overseas have, in fact, depleted the strength. I mean, the Soviet Union in Afghanistan would be a good example where overseas adventuring, in fact, depleted strength. We will move on because Gen Z activist and Parkland shooting survivor David Hogg is out at the DNC. We'll tell you more next. David Hogg has been ousted as Vice Chair of the Democratic National Committee. He announced Wednesday he will not seek re-election for the ranking position. This came after the committee voted to vacate him from the role in a procedural dispute. Malcolm Kenyatta, who was also Vice Chair, was also vacated by the same means. In a statement, Hogg wrote in part, quote, "I came into this role to play a positive role in creating the change our party needs. Ultimately, I have decided to not run in this upcoming election so the party can focus on what really matters. I need to do this work with leaders we deserve, and it is going to remain my #1 mission to build the strongest party possible."
This caps months-long party infighting that the Gen Zers set off after he declared his group, Leaders We Deserve, would be shelling out $20 million to primary Democratic incumbents. The party has been furious with Hogg, to say the least. They leaned into a technicality to push him out based on DNC rules. The executive committee must be gender diverse. Pollster Nate Silver reacted, posting, quote, "This is Olympic-level DNCing. You can't DNC any harder than this." Democratic strategist Max Burns weighed in, writing, quote, "I'm really peeved with how this decision casts doubt on the legitimacy of Kenyatta's big win and turns this entire thing into a spectacle about David Hogg. If the DNC doesn't see value in building up genuine party leaders like Malcolm Kenyatta, we are in serious trouble."
I do think Malcolm Kenyatta has been rather the forgotten victim in all of this.
Very true.
He's not getting a lot of publicity, and he's got caught up in this issue about how exactly he and Hogg were elected and the elections being removed. Now, I assume Kenyatta will seek the office again, which Hogg is not doing.
Yeah.
So there's that. I think you tend to get a little more exercised about David Hogg than I do. I don't mind him. I don't also think he's the guru or messiah to lead Democrats out of the wilderness. I think he has a point about fresh leadership. He's obviously on the progressive side. I think there are legitimate criticisms that he hasn't really been completely specific about what he believes, and it's this thing about, like, well, Democrats are too old and dying in office in some cases, but there are also some really good people and some young people that we don't want to be associated with, and his statement went into all of that. Obviously, the DNC was not particularly thrilled at someone with that level of name recognition threatening or promising to spend money on primary challenges to incumbents. So I'm not that surprised by what has happened, is my bottom line.
Yeah, exactly. I think that looking at the DNC rules, they did misapply them, and the election was not run properly. According to their gender equity rules, they're supposed to, after they run the first vice chair election, depending on who's elected, whether it's a man or a woman, the voters in the second election are then supposed to have to rank a member of the opposite sex to be their #1 choice, and then so forth with the third and fourth elections. But what they did instead is, after a woman was elected on the first ballot, on the second ballot they did a joint election of Hogg and Kenyatta, which is why he got caught up in this.
Okay.
So I think it was done incorrectly, but would anyone have challenged this if it weren't for the fact that David Hogg was running afoul of DNC convention? And as much as I think it is very much a DNC sort of establishment-y move, I do think, if something similar happened at the RNC and a vice chair was openly calling for primarying incumbents in safe seats in very heavily Democratic districts, I expect the same thing would probably happen.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any great love for either of the party committees, but they exist, and they exist for the party to win elections.
Right.
So it's not surprising that they are going to be opposed to challenges to incumbent office holders, unless that person is in really egregious, disgrace at somebody who's committed a crime.
Or like a Steve King figure.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly, where it's just like, okay, this guy's really hurting the party, we have to get rid of him, essentially. But otherwise, they are always going to favour incumbents. Now, of course, that can topple over into something that happened in the presidential process in 2016, certainly, where the DNC pretty obviously and undeniably put a thumb on the scales in favour of Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders. But when it comes to congressional or Senate seats, I think Hogg is primarily focused on congressional seats. Like, the party committees are going to support the incumbents unless there's some very extreme reason not to.
Yeah, that's right. And I think outside of that, Hogg did have legitimate criticisms of the Democratic Party. You mentioned the age issue. There have been several Democratic congresspeople who have died in office in just the past year, and also talking about how the party needs to appeal more to young men. And so I think he actually had the right criticism of the party, but as you pointed out, it wasn't really clear what his solutions were outside of these primary challenges, and that's where he really ran into trouble.
Right, and I think that's one of the things that caused aggravation among more rank-and-file Democrats who themselves often do have criticisms of the leadership of the party or a lack of sort of impetus or momentum right now. Hogg in his statement pointed out that for all that Trump has done, which obviously most Democrats loathe, the approval rating of the Democratic Party is somewhere in the high 20s. So, you know, that's still pretty dismal. When he was sort of suggesting what might be the road forward, he focused a lot on long past achievements of the Democratic Party. I mean, he talked about things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. He did, to be fair, talk about the Affordable Care Act. So by implication, he wants them, I think, to focus on large-scale domestic policy goals, but it's not all that clear. And as you say, that's where the criticism, I think, has more validity often.
Yeah, I wonder, too, if this will cause not the DNC, because they voted, obviously, to remove Hogg, but whether people adjacent to the party apparatus will start to critique this voting rule in regards to the gender split, right? Because a lot of young people and progressives in the party were quite excited about Hogg's tenure as DNC vice chair. And Kenyatta, of course, is a black man, so he represents racial diversity. Will they take a second look at this and say, okay, maybe this didn't have the intended effect, since we're pushing out people who we otherwise believe are capable or qualified to be in this role because they happen to be a white male?
Yeah, I think you made an important point earlier when you said that, yes, the election of Hogg and Kenyatta was in contravention of these bylaws, but would anyone really have seized upon it? It is that thing of focusing on what is not exactly a technicality, it's a breach of the bylaws, but I think that would have been let slide if David Hogg was fully enthused about incumbents rather than suggesting he would finance challengers.
Yeah, I suspect that's the case too. It's kind of similar with the recent attacks on John Fetterman's mental health, where there were concerns about this when he was running for election the first time, but then they were only brought up by members of his own party when he started pushing back on the popular wisdom on Israel and the border and things like that.
I would have a more negative view on Fetterman, but we'll get into that some other time.
Ex-Biden aides agree to testify for a GOP probe into the former president's mental acuity. That's next on Rising.
former Biden aides have agreed to testify to the House Oversight Committee about the former president's health and mental acuity.
House Oversight Chair James Comer is spearheading the investigation into the alleged cover-up of Biden's cognitive decline.
The 4 aides who are set to testify are Neera Tanden, former director of the Domestic Policy Council and staff secretary, Anthony Bernal, former assistant to the president and senior advisor to First Lady Jill Biden, Ashley Williams, former special assistant to the president and deputy director of Oval Office operations, and Annie Tomasini, Biden's former deputy chief of staff.
Comer sent another wave of letters to other Biden advisors and said he would subpoena them if they refused to cooperate. Comer also sent a subpoena to Biden's physician, Dr. Kevin O'Connor. The GOP's Oversight Committee posted on X, "This is a scandal of historical proportions and we will investigate it thoroughly."
Former President Biden released a statement last week responding to Trump announcing an investigation into the former president and his alleged use of AutoPen. Biden said, quote, "Let me be clear, I made the decisions during my presidency. I made the decisions about the pardons, executive orders, legislation, and proclamations. Any suggestion that I didn't is ridiculous and false. This is nothing more than a distraction by Donald Trump and congressional Republicans who are working to push disastrous legislation that would cut essential programs like Medicaid and raise costs on American families, all to pay for tax breaks for the ultra-wealthy and big corporations." Before we get into the meat of this, Amber, just let me clarify something I said there. We said Biden's alleged use of AutoPen. There's no doubt that Biden used an AutoPen, as Trump has on occasion and as other recent presidents have. The accusation is the use of the AutoPen was in some way related to his cognitive decline.
Right,
so,
yeah. The idea that he was not actively
in control, making the decisions.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, what do you think of this more broadly?
Well, I support the investigation. I think that's no secret. I mean, assuming that these aides knew that Biden was in cognitive decline and were perhaps covering up for him or telling lies to the media, I mean, the American people, I think, deserve to know that. I think the broader question is, what do they hope to gain from the investigation outside of some kind of transparency or information gathering? Typically, these investigations have these, blow-up testimonies, and then they never really go anywhere. But I do think they're going to look pretty closely at these AutoPen issues. The Heritage Foundation and Power the Future both provided reports claiming that there were instances where Biden had signed pardons with the AutoPen or signed executive orders with the AutoPen where he wasn't present at the White House or perhaps wasn't aware that it was being used. And so those are the specific allegations that I think they'll look into in terms of criminality. But everything else seems to be more of a mission of trying to provide more transparency for the American people.
I see it very much as a messaging operation by the Republican Party. Now, that is something that both parties engage in, of course. You try to keep the spotlight on topics that are more politically advantageous to your side and keep it off topics that are more politically advantageous to the other side. In this particular instance, I think that it is really a mechanism to keep Biden's cognitive state in the news and to keep people talking about it, and it by its very nature puts Democrats in an awkward position because you don't really want to talk about the topic because you don't, I'm talking here about elected officials in the Democratic Party, they don't really want to just lay into Biden in a way that I think feels gratuitous at this point, but they also don't want him to be the face of their party now that he's out of office and they're trying to find a future face of the party. So all of that, I think, is really where this is coming from. There are other debates in the minutiae about using the AutoPen. The Department of Justice during George W. Bush's administration looked into, whether it was fully legal, and they concluded that it was. In terms of pardons, I was intrigued to find out during my own research this. There was a memo back in 1929 from the U.S. Solicitor General saying that pardons don't even have to necessarily need to be signed by the president. So that, and there is some suggestion that a president could theoretically pardon people in secret and never, state it publicly. But in any event, the point here is that I think we're in messaging wars where the GOP is trying to keep the focus on Biden's age.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and it's obviously politically advantageous for Republicans. And I'm very curious to hear what some of these Biden aides do say in testimony, because there's been some conflicting public reporting about what they actually believe about Biden's cognitive decline. For example, Ron Klain was quoted in a book as saying that Biden was disappearing during debate prep. He was falling asleep by the pool and appeared frequently confused and unable to follow some of the lines of questioning that he was receiving. But then later on, when he was asked about those comments, he sort of backtracked a bit, saying to Politico, "My point wasn't that the president lacked mental acuity. He was out of it because he had been sidelined, not because he lacked capacity." Some of the other advisors who are agreeing to these voluntary testimonies are Neera Tanden, who's known Biden for at least 20 years. So she would have potentially some insight as to whether he lost a step in his later years in office. And then Anthony Bernal and Annie Tomasini were called because they were cited in Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson's book as part of the Politburo that surrounded Joe Biden and were in charge of basically keeping him sheltered from other members of the administration so as to prevent too many people from knowing about what was happening with his mental acuity. One of the individuals who has not been called yet, who Dr. Ronnie Jackson, member of Congress, suggested to us they should call, is the White House staff secretary. He said, quote, "The staff secretary handles every piece of paper that goes in and out of the Oval Office and everything that has the president's signature on it. So we'll see if Republicans heed his advice and add that to the list of witnesses."
Yeah, I mean, Ronnie Johnson's an extremely controversial figure, as you know, but a member of Congress, if he wants to call for that, he's welcome to call for it. In relation to the people testifying, a couple of things. One is, I just think as a abstract matter, this will be an interesting test of what people tell authors and what they tell Congress under oath, and that is always an interesting issue. Also, before our audience gets too excited about this forthcoming testimony from this quartet, my understanding is they're testifying in private, but the transcripts will be released, so these will not be huge, televised set pieces in that sense.
Right, and then we also have to wait for the date of Dr. Kevin O'Connor because he has not agreed to voluntary testimony. He's being subpoenaed by House Oversight. So unclear if he'll comply with the subpoena or if they will, if they'll have to perhaps pursue some kind of criminal charge if he defies it.
We shall see what happens there. And meanwhile, up next, the Trump administration is positive about the new US-China trade deal framework. But is that really sealed? We'll talk about it next on Rising. Is the US-China deal actually sealed? Well, the details are a bit sketchy. President Trump Wednesday announced a new trade deal framework between the US and China.
In a Truth Social post, Trump wrote, "Our deal with China is done, subject to final approval with President Xi and me. Full magnets and any necessary rare earths will be supplied upfront by China. Likewise, we will provide to China what was agreed to, including Chinese students using our colleges and universities, which has always been good with me. We are getting a total of 55% tariffs. China is getting 10%. Relationship is excellent."
The agreement came after 2 days of negotiations between Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and their Chinese counterparts in London. Here's Secretary Lutnick speaking to CNBC about the deal.
We'll take off our measures, and we're in a great place with China. Really, really feels good. Now, President Trump's got to approve the final wording. President Xi's got to approve the final stuff. It's not really wording, it's really the deal. But both sides are really positive. I mean, I feel great about it.
According to Chinese state media, China's vice commerce minister said the talks were, quote, professional, rational, in-depth, and candid. Tensions between the U.S. and China started to spiral after President Trump announced his Liberation Day tariffs in early April. It escalated further when Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced the revocation of visas of some Chinese students, including those connected to the CCP or studying in critical fields.
So in those cases, the Chinese students weren't so good with Trump then when Rubio was revoking those things. It's hard to sometimes keep track of the tariff situation because it has changed so much. Tariffs on China under the Trump administration have gone from 20% to 54%, kept spiraling up to 145%. Now this purportedly is back down to 30%. The 55% figure that Trump is citing was clarified later by the White House to incorporate tariffs on China that had been put on during his first term. So that is what he is claiming there. To my mind, there's quite a lot of vagueness around this. I think that it is telling, perhaps, that the Trump administration was promising this plethora of trade deals, which have largely not happened. This is a general framework. The agreement with the United Kingdom was pretty limited in scope, and we haven't had finalized trade deals other than that. But the de-escalation of tariffs, I think, is broadly speaking a good thing. So if this does that, that's interesting.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, the goal, I think, ultimately with China in particular was to get them to reduce their tariffs on us by slapping heavy tariffs on them. We seem to be moving to that place, but the flip on the Chinese student visas is very troubling to me. Of course, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, in his announcement of the revocation of those visas, called this a national security threat. We've heard similar things from the FBI director, the Department of Justice, and now Trump is saying, actually, they were always good with me. Right. Well, clearly they weren't. Right. And we also just had an indictment last week of 3 Chinese nationals who were trying to smuggle biological materials into a lab at the University of Michigan. Biological materials that could cause damage to millions of acres of crops in the United States and also have health ramifications for both cattle as well as humans. And now, apparently, no big deal. We're not going to screen at all.
We're all good.
Yeah, and if we had gotten a question during the press briefing yesterday, we were going to ask about this change-up, and I'll read you the question we were going to ask. Sure. We unfortunately didn't get one. But 3 Chinese nationals connected with the University of Michigan were just criminally charged with smuggling biological materials into the U.S. The president's top security officials have raised big concerns about Chinese students on American college campuses. How does the president's new agreement with China square with this administration's work thus far to safeguard American universities from CCP influence? I'd like an answer to that.
I'd have asked that question if you'd given it to me, Amber, though I wasn't down there.
Thank you.
I wasn't down there yesterday. But no, I mean, that's a completely valid question, and it does, I think, point to 2 things. One is these sort of shifting rationales. So on one hand, it's like, well, Chinese students are all in some fashion prone to being influenced by the CCP, and therefore we have to be careful with them. Oh, no, we don't actually. It's all good. I mean, that change is unexplained in any meaningful way. The case that you mentioned, the potential sabotage of crops, that was a really interesting case that I know we covered it to some extent, and it got a degree of publicity, but in my mind should have got more. It was so intriguing, and they were hidden away in these little baggies because you only need a very small amount of the substance in question to wreak havoc. So that was legitimately a very interesting case. The other thing I think that the Chinese student issue goes to is the way that the trade issue has become much broader than just tariffs. So it now encompasses things like the access of Chinese students to American universities. But of course, on the other side of the equation, it now as well covers these rare minerals that China has, which are of such importance to a whole host of American industries. It seems like that was one of China's main points of leverage in these discussions. Trump has said that that is now being resolved. But to me, it's just interesting that there is more of a totality of things involved in trade negotiations. Now, it's not really purely a tariffs negotiation.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, those rare earth minerals are really key to things like chip making, as well as electric vehicle battery making and other forms of renewable energy, which China controls a lot of the mines in Africa for those rare earth minerals, which has been a point of contention for the United States, especially as those renewable energy markets are expanding, especially on the EV front. And on the case about the agricultural potential bioweapon at the University of Michigan, China owns a lot of farmland in the United States, which has been something that Republicans have introduced bills trying to ban over the past 5 to 10 years. They've also pointed out that a lot of the farmland that China owns is close to U.S. military bases. You remember this Ukrainian drone attack that involved shipping containers where the drones were inside and they came out in Russia. There were concerns raised by security officials that China could launch a similar attack based on the land that they own near U.S. military bases that have a lot of shipping containers on them, coincidentally. So it really is a very broad issue in terms of Chinese influence in the U.S. And I do think that this particular deal seems to underplay how important some of those ancillary issues to the tariffs are.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think in relation to that as well, there is just this, I think both liberals generally and Democrats have to be wary about not getting into the situation where in the process of criticizing Trump, and I think there are many valid reasons to criticize Trump, we'll get into some of them in a second, but you don't want to move from that into downplaying the fact that the United States has real enemies and that those enemies are involved in really nefarious things. And so you do have to figure out how you guard against those. And whoever's president of the United States is somewhat beside the point to that overall broader effort.
Sure, and one of the things that Biden did that I agreed with was keeping the tariffs on China during his presidency.
Absolutely.
Up next, Bob Costas slams the mainstream media. We'll tell you why on Rising.
sportscaster Bob Costas had some choice words for the mainstream media, who he thinks have not been tough enough when covering Trump 2.0. Costas singled out many news outlets, including ABC News, CBS News and CNN, at this year's Mirror Awards in New York. Here's Costas taking a jab at the state of the media under the current Trump administration.
It does not mean that the legacy or mainstream media doesn't screw up from time to time or have blind spots or misplaced narratives. But if the answer to that is MAGA media, if the answer to that is Donald Trump's view of the world, which is only through a prism of what benefits him, there are no higher ideals, there are no principles at work other than what benefits him, I'll stay with where we are without correction, if the correction is what Donald Trump represents.
Costas then went on to criticize ABC News for settling a lawsuit that stemmed from comments by its host, George Stephanopoulos. Let's watch.
His FCC intimidated ABC into refuting George Stephanopoulos. All they should have said was, George misspoke. The president, that paragon of virtue, was only found guilty of sexual assault, not rape. So we stand corrected. They didn't have to pay a $15 million ransom.
Costas also condemned Paramount, which is controlled by Shari Redstone. Let's watch that.
Did Shari Redstone, because she wants to affect a merger that Trump's FCC could stand in the way of, did she have to besmirch and undercut the gold standard in our lifetime of broadcast journalism, 60 Minutes? Paying $20 million in ransom to Trump is just the cost of doing business when there's billions of dollars at stake. These are ongoing assaults on the basic idea of a free press.
Well, I'm happy to defend Bob Costas, which I suspect you're not going to do, but I think, firstly, I think he's a great broadcaster. I think he's really one of the best. But secondly, I think he's largely right in what he said there, particularly in relation to the Paramount case and in relation to the idea that the media is some media outlets, I should say, are too timid in calling out Trump's overreach or creeping authoritarianism. Now, the ABC case is much more debatable because what George Stephanopoulos said about Trump wasn't correct. He said that he had been found liable, of rape, and he had been found liable of sexual assault. ABC could have defended that or could have gone to court on it and said what Costas had suggested, but it would still have been putting them in the place of defending a false statement. And I don't think as a broadcaster or as any other news organisation, you want to do that. You want to be put in that position. They did give $15 million as a settlement, which seems rather large. But in terms of Paramount, they certainly, in my view, shouldn't settle his what I consider ridiculous $20 billion suit over the CBS interview of Kamala Harris. We've spoken about that interview before. I think we have divergent views on it. I think that 60 Minutes did completely routine condensing of answers for time purposes. Trump makes different allegations. I don't think Paramount should settle that. I think it would be a ridiculous surrender if they did. And I think that the many elements of the media should be stronger in their criticisms of Trump.
It's definitely true that Paramount is seeking to settle that case in part because they have this merger that they want approved by the Trump administration. As you mentioned, the ABC News lawsuit is obviously much different, but I obviously don't feel like the media has been pulling its punches on Trump, and I'm kind of curious where you get that impression. I mean, I do my media diet every morning as I look at the home pages of the New York Times, of the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and other mainstream outlets, and I find the coverage to be overwhelmingly negative about the Trump administration. I
don't know. Firstly, I wouldn't necessarily describe it as overwhelmingly negative, but I think the failing, and I think this is what Costas was addressing, was in a joining of the dots about various things or an emphasis on the degree to which Trump is an aberrational president, in my view. So, I mean, there's a list of things that you could cite there. I actually had to write some of them down to remind myself. So he has attacked judges hundreds of times, called for their impeachment. He has defied the courts for weeks on Kilmore Abrego Garcia. He fired a prosecutor who told the truth in that case. sued 60 Minutes for $20 billion for doing something that is just standard practice. He punished law firms for representing opponents of his. He has tried to take away their business. He has sent Venezuelans to El Salvador under the Alien Enemies Act, a law that requires an invasion by a foreign government, which has not happened, and on and on and on. In addition to things like the meme coin, which are mechanisms by which people can buy influence with the President of the United States. He has complained about his predecessor's family's business dealings, while the Trump organization has done real estate deals that have had an involvement from the governments of Qatar, Oman, Saudi Arabia. We could continue on. He is an aberrational figure.
I feel like the media has covered all of that, though. I mean, if I just do a Google search for authoritarian from the Washington Post website, I immediately get multiple articles from this year. What America could look like a decade from now. Political scientists and historians weigh in on authoritarianism's impact on the U.S. They fled authoritarian countries. Here's what they're experiencing now in the United States. Under Trump, the authoritarian age comes into focus.
Yeah.
Even in February of last year, how Trump is becoming more authoritarian. In the age of Trump, global authoritarianism continues its rise. The increasingly authoritarian, curious Republican Party. I mean, that only took me 5 seconds to find.
Sure.
I think all of this has been repeatedly covered by the media.
But people from, I mean, you're arguing there that the Washington Post is representative of the media,
Well, I'm
which
giving
is
an example. I could do the New York
yeah, but I
Times,
mean,
too.
there are all sorts of other organizations that have not. I mean, have the major broadcasters, for example, had that amount of focus? I think that Fox News obviously has run defense for Trump on a lot of these things. We'll get to one instance of those later. But the point that Costas is emphasizing is the, as I say, aberrational nature of the Trump presidency. I think that is something that there is deserving of more coverage rather than less.
Gosh, I think there's so much already. I'm really
I don't think there's
shocked.
enough. We differ on this one at least.
Definitely, yeah. I'm not even sure what else to say. I just think our view of the media is so fundamentally different.
Possibly. I mean, I just think that, well, I mean, I think that our views of the Trump presidency are fundamentally different, and that may be something that is fueling our difference in our view of this topic. The dangers of the Trump presidency seem to me to be severe. I think he's easily the most dangerous president of my lifetime. And I was born in the dying days of the Richard Nixon presidency, so that's how old I am. I think that he has, Costas's view beyond media coverage was the President of the United States has absolutely no regard and in fact has contempt for basic American principles and basic common decency. I think that is a correct assessment. And I think some of the things I cited, and we could go further on through that list, are evidence of it.
I'll ask you a different question just because we obviously aren't
disagree.
going to find an area of agreement on that. But do you think that the media's overwhelmingly negative coverage of Trump back in 2016, particularly in their acceptance of the idea that he had colluded with Russia to win the election and a lot of that coming unraveled, particularly the Steele dossier, do you think that really damaged their ability to get their viewers or listeners or readers to accept their sort of, I would describe them as hyperbolic, you would describe them as accurate depictions of the Trump presidency?
Let me answer that as honestly as I can. I think that some coverage of the Russia stuff was plainly overblown, and I think that did damage the media's credibility. And I think there have been other things that have damaged the media's credibility. Costas said in those remarks that we played that he acknowledged some mistakes on the media's part, but if I think he said if the corrective was Trump, he doesn't want that corrective, which would be basically where I came down on that. Now, without getting back through the whole weeds of the Russia investigation, Mueller came out with his report, which was more equivocal than, say, Bill Barr portrayed it as in the immediate presentation of those facts. The broader point I would make, Amber, is that where I think we differ on those is that I think there has been a decades-long attempt to discredit the conventional media by conservatives who believe it's overly liberal.
Okay. All right. Up next.
It's the battle of the influencers, and one is wielding immigration and customs enforcement as a weapon. That's next on Rising.
Well, it seems that neither fame nor influence can escape Trump's mass deportation crackdown. The latest to apparently be caught in ICE's net, one of TikTok's most popular stars.
Khaby Lame, a 25-year-old TikToker with more than 162 million followers, was detained by ICE Friday at the Las Vegas airport, according to an ICE spokesperson. The department says Lame arrived in the US on April 30th and overstayed the terms of his visa. And after being detained, he was allowed to leave the country without an official deportation order. Lame has not publicly commented on the incident.
Another Gen Z influencer, Bo Loudon, has taken credit for getting Lame deported. In a series of posts on X, Loudon called Lame a far-left illegal alien multiple times and said, quote, "I've been working with the Patriots at President Trump's DHS to make this happen." But taking credit apparently had mixed receptions. Loudon claimed multiple outlets called him a rat. The far-left Daily Beast just called me a rat, he posted, and The Sun dubbed me a rat extraordinaire. He continued, "I wish Khaby well and hope he returns as a law-abiding citizen."
So, fellow users were quick to point out on multiple posts from Loudon that Lame is not a citizen. He was born in Senegal, has Italian citizenship, and has never resided in the US. They also point out that his content is apolitical and largely consists of silent reactions to life hack videos. So I know nothing about this guy whatsoever except what we have just read out. He's 160 million followers, I think we said. That's a lot. I mean, I thought this was basically a fairly, standard situation. The guy overstayed his visa. I'm not going to defend someone being exempt from the laws because they have a lot of TikTok followers any more than I would exempt it if they were wealthy or politically connected or anything else. It seems like he overstayed his visa. No one seems to be really disputing that, and he was offered the chance to remove himself, and he did. Now, I had not been aware of the guy kind of daubing him in, which seems kind of unpleasant. I mean, I don't know that we should really be in the process of calling the feds on people for overstaying a visa. And it's also to do so publicly seems kind of gratuitous. So I don't love snitching, but there we are.
Yeah, the celebratory laugh was a bit much.
Yeah.
Rad extraordinaire, he's called.
Yeah.
Actually, Beau Loudon is the son of Gina Loudon, who is another pro-Trump influencer who I think had some involvement in the first Trump administration. So he's sort of grown up in the Trump spotlight. But yeah, I didn't know this guy from his name, but then I went to watch some of the TikTok videos when I heard we were doing this story. And I was like, oh, I've seen those. They're actually quite good. He follows these weird life hack videos of, TikTok influencers doing weird things on camera and trying to show people that they're, come up with some new way to wash the dishes or whatever it is. Yeah. And he just reacts silently in very funny ways. He's got very great facial expressions. But yes, he overstayed the visa. And you know what? I think it worked out well. He was able to voluntarily deport so that he does have the opportunity in the future to immigrate to the U.S. legally, which is an option also offered to other illegal immigrants, even with a gift of $1,000 if they decide to self-deport, and then they won't be banned from future access.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it seems a fairly mild offence, to say the least. I mean, lots of people overstay their visas. It's understandable then that he should be allowed to go without having a deportation order against him. And, if he wants to make his TikTok videos from wherever he lives and try his best to come back in again at some later point, good for him.
Yeah, and maybe this being such a high-profile case will serve as a warning for other people overstaying their visas to maybe self-deport as well, and maybe that's what the Trump administration was hoping.
Maybe it will publicize that topic at least. Very briefly, Amber, because we have to go, I just want to, for 1 second, congratulate you. Yesterday, we were talking about Terry Moran, and Amber said, oh, he might be just trying to get publicity if he's going to do Substack with his criticisms of Stephen Miller. Terry Moran is now out at ABC, and last night announced he's going to Substack.
Wow.
So, Amber Duke.
Props to me. I'm Nostradamus. This is why you watch Rising. That's going to do it for us, actually, on Rising Live. Look out for more exclusive YouTube content coming your way today. And as always, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.